Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Rita Tritcher. I'm a senior business writer and columnist here at the Globe and Mail, and I am very pleased to be your host and moderator for today's webcast. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the Globe and Mail's headquarters is situated on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. My colleagues and I are very grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. The topic of today's webcast is Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 goals, and number 10 is Advancing Reconciliation with Indigenous Peoples. It's a significantly important goal given many Indigenous communities are on the front lines of the effects of climate change. Others face inequalities related to food security, housing, and opportunities for economic participation. At the same time, Indigenous communities and businesses are providing leadership that we all need to address climate change and issues of social justice. Over the next hour, we will talk about Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for short, and how businesses can start and expand the right program. As we go along, please type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can a little later on in the webcast. Today's event is sponsored by HCL Technologies. We are pleased to have a speaker from HCL on our webcast today, along with other experts who are leaders and who are joining us independently in many other sectors. So let's get started. My first guest today is Elizabeth Dove, Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network Canada, which is dedicated to helping Canadian organizations implement the SDGs. So welcome, Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us. We're going to jump right in to questions. Elizabeth, for those in the audience who may not be familiar, could you please tell us very briefly about the SDGs? What are they?
Certainly, Rita, and again, thanks so much for having me here today. The SDGs are simply the world's most important to-do list. We're in the week right now of COP28, but actually the original COP, if you would, was in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro with the Earth Summit. And it was at that time there was a comprehensive plan that more than 178 countries adopted to build a global partnership for sustainable development. You skip ahead to 2000 when we had the initiation of the Millennium Development Goals. Those were just 8 goals back then. And a lot of the efforts were focused on the developing world or the global south. But seeing that so many of these needs are global everywhere. You mentioned reducing inequalities, poverty, literacy, gender equality, these are global. So in January of 2015, the UN General Assembly began negotiations for what on January 1st, 2016 became the 17 Sustainable Development Goals with 169 targets, 247 quantifiable indicators. Can you name them all, Rita?
No, I can't.
No, they would be hard to come up with, but let's say that they are all along 5 key tracks: people, prosperity, planet, peace, and partnership.
Okay, that's great. And I mean, this should be self-evident, but I have to ask the question, why do they matter?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I really think that the earlier little sister, or maybe big sister, the Millennium Development Goals, told us a lot about how to create a global framework for change that way. So they do have this ability, although voluntary, to create a shared framework, language, again, these indicators for all countries and all sectors to work in. There is a real intention for roles for NGOs, for academia, for federal governments, right down to city governments, and of course for business as well. And within this framework, country governments make specific commitments that they can be held accountable to. So in Canada's case, we did our second voluntary national review presented in 2023 and developed in consultation and looking at the collaborative efforts of provincial, territorial, municipal, Indigenous organizations, nonprofit organizations, academia, private sector, and civil society. Canada really takes what they call a whole of society approach to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay, and so how is Canada doing and performing with this whole of society approach? And uh, more specifically, how are Canadian businesses performing?
Right. Well, it's a lot to wrap your arms around. I think it is a real challenge. There's a lot of conversation about, where can an entity say that they have the attribution of a change is to the work that they've done, or where is the contributive efforts? And so the federal government has their hands really full trying to figure out how to, as does every country government, of how to do the measuring. So I'll start off by saying that Canada's commitments are a 5-part national strategy around fostering leadership and governance and policy coherence, raising awareness of the goals and engagement and partnerships, increasing accountability and transparency, measurement and reporting, very specifically advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples to advance the 2030 agenda, and investing in the SDGs. What's interesting is that you will find most organizations who have committed themselves, and most governments, to the SDGs, they're not trying to wrap their arms around 17 in the same way. In fact, I once saw somebody taking a bunch of cubes. These are very popular with the beautiful tiles like what we have behind Todd's background here, and trying to carry them out of the room, and they couldn't, they were sort of falling out. And this is sort of a challenge I find with organizations and even governments as well. We can't put our arms equally around some, and sometimes we don't need to. That's not where we are best positioned to make that change. In Canada, the domestic and international priorities are no poverty, quality education, gender equality, climate change, and partnership for the goals, not at the expense of not taking care of all 17, but that's where the emphasis is. And so partners and stakeholders are asked to, and have responded to that call by integrating SDGs into their work, having innovative partnerships to drive progress, to sharing knowledge and best practice, including across business. There's a great indicator framework if anyone wants to dig into how Canada is doing specifically. But one thing that's really wonderful about the way Canada has addressed its voluntary national review is it's looked at what it's doing well and where it needs improvement too. So, for example, on the number one goal, no poverty, there's a lot of great advancements in Canada on looking after students, families with young children around childcare, trying to move towards better reconciliation, and educational investments, which are also connected to poverty. A lot of these are very intertwined, but there's also a recognition that more could be done for supporting persons with disabilities. It's also easier for the federal government to measure things that it controls and measures. So if you take a look at decent work and economic growth, that's number 8. It's easier for them to talk about protecting labor rights and promoting safe work, specifically around things like finding workmen's compensation stats, where have there been lost days of work or lost lives. It's harder for them to measure what is the level of national compliance for businesses around labor rights. So this is where I think the federal government and governments around the world are trying to find a way to bring together the efforts of government work and business work to have that coherence of action, but also that coherence of how we're kind of measuring these things all the same.
Okay, so do we have a sense, though, that in what areas businesses are proving to be most effective in terms of the various SDGs?
Yes, absolutely. The UN Global Compact, just a little bit of background about ourselves. It's really our vision to mobilize a global movement of sustainable companies and stakeholders to create the world we want. And we do that by having companies commit to 10 principles, UN Global Compact principles, at the highest level of the organization, at the CEO level, to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and report on this annually. And we actually have over 20,000 companies as part of our movement globally, which makes us the largest corporate sustainability movement and the only agency actually of the UN that's specifically mandated to work with companies on the SDGs. So while certainly we do help companies wrap their arms around as many of the SDGs that they are committed to and passionate about and feel that they are well positioned to work on, As you may have heard, we are now halfway to 2030, halfway through that 15-year commitment, and we are very far behind in a lot of areas globally, all of us. We are off track on indicators for 85% of them, and it's for that reason the UN Global Compact has focused on 5 areas where business is most particularly positioned to be making the biggest impact faster. Those include gender equality, climate action, a living wage, water resilience, and finance and investment. And just a quick riddle for you, Rita. Besides being Sustainable Development Goals indicators, what does gender equality, living wage, and companies meeting net zero have in common?
Oh, wow. I mean, it's all about advancing equality.
That's true. And protecting the earth as well. But they are amongst the indicators that we are very far behind on. At this rate, it'll take us 160 years to achieve gender equality worldwide. A third of workers make less than they need to live on. And sadly, in the business community, 9 out of 10 CEOs are not on track to meet their net zero commitments.
Okay, so that brings me to my question about regulation. What is the regulatory landscape for SDGs in Canada? And, you've touched on this a little bit, but how do the SDGs fit into other reporting requirements or ESG?
Right. Well, in Canada, compared to most other G20 countries, where our regulatory landscape for ESG is much less mature. For Canada, federally regulated banks, they have to report on greenhouse gas emissions throughout their value chain. And with Canada's new Modern Slavery Act coming online, starting in January 1st of the coming year, with companies as small as 250 employees, we actually see that as a really significant advancement in a Canadian regulatory environment around really, really good business practices. But most other ESG reporting and disclosures for Canadian companies are voluntary, but with increasing pressure for companies of all sizes to report on their human rights and environmental impact for their clients or where they are vendors. So we really believe that when companies are able to align with the UN Global Compact's 10 principles to advance the goals in a community of practice like one we offer, with the most up-to-date learning tools and resources, it puts companies in a sustainable and ethical framework that allows them to respond with assurance to the ongoing advances in regulatory and business mandated reporting and disclosures worldwide. So even if ours are a little bit nascent, being in that responsible framework, having tools and having the SDGs to line up against is going to get you there regardless of the changes and advancement in the regulatory framework.
Okay, and you bring up the Modern Slavery Act. That's something that we'll be writing more about here at the Globe and Mail, so everyone stay tuned for that. Just one final question for you, Elizabeth. What tools or resources can businesses look to for help with the SDGs?
Wow. Okay. Well, should you turn to our website, the UN Global Compact, you can find all kinds of tools that exist there to help you measure and get on your path. But as members of the UN Global Compact, you have access to things like accelerators, which helps a team across borders work together on a strategy where they are going to come out with an actionable plan. We have peer-to-peer learning programs. We have one-off or learn at your own pace programs. And one of the things that has been really exciting for a lot of companies is our academy, where we have some of the most up-to-date learning tools for employees of all stages and levels in a company in 6 languages. So that allows an enterprise sort of wherever it is in the world to be able to roll out a really similar understanding and create that real employee integration with SDG so that everyone is a part of the change that the company is trying to make in the world.
Okay, great. We're going to have to leave the conversation there, but Elizabeth is going to be back for the audience Q&A a little bit later on in the webcast. So thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us today. Next, we have a panel discussion featuring business leaders sharing how to put SDGs in action. This is where you're going to get some practical advice. So we're going to bring them in now. First, we have Dr. Nidhi Pundir, who is Global Head of CSR and Director of the HCL Foundation. Welcome. Next, we have Todd Copewell, Senior Director of Sustainability and ESG Disclosure with Nutrien. Also joining us is Patrice Mousseau, Founder and CEO of Satya Organic. And last but certainly not least, we have Maria Saros, Vice President and Global Head of Social Impact with the Bank of Nova Scotia. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited by this discussion we're going to have. I'd like to start by asking each of you to share briefly what SDG goal or goals you are working on at your companies and provide, some examples to people in the audience. And we're going to go in this order: Todd, Maria, Patrice, and Nidhi. So Todd, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Rita, and thank you to everyone joining us today. As Canada's largest agricultural company and the world's largest fertilizer producer and ag retailer, you might guess that feeding the planet is a top priority for us. And so SDG number 2, Zero Hunger, is definitely what drives our sustainability approach. And this SDG directly impacts Nutrien's core business of sustainable agriculture and is connected directly to our purpose, which is feeding the future. And so our efforts are extended across our company and our value chain with this SDG, and ambitious commitments have been set to the goal indicators for SDG number 2. But what's interesting is we do directly impact, Rita, 11 SDGs. In agriculture, it's almost impacting all of them directly or indirectly. And so we have different levels of impact. And that's a level 1, SDG number 2. Level 2 for us is called commitments. And there's 3 there as well. There's SDG 10, 13, and 17. And these SDGs, have significant environmental or social impact and are relevant to our operations and represent a high interest for our stakeholders. And so we need to have transformational commitments set in place for these specific SDGs as well.
Okay, great. Maria, tell us a bit about what's going on at Scotiabank.
Thanks, Rita, and hello, everybody. So pleased to be among this esteemed group of leaders. I think from our standpoint, the SDGs provide, certainly a flexible framework from which to align to. I really appreciated Elizabeth's comment about the literal 19 cubes and how challenging it could be to juggle all of those. We do have well-documented and well-established initiatives attached to each of the SDGs. But for the purposes of hopefully how I can be helpful to this discussion, I'll focus mostly on the social, given that that's where my remit lies. So we start with our purpose. As Todd said, everything does have to start with the foundational. And for us at Scotiabank, it really is around this concept of being there for every future and delivering inclusive and sustainable growth. So I think SDGs that are oriented towards gender equality, poverty reduction, those really speak to us in terms of our social impact strategies. We think about the influence that we have across 3 main strata, primarily, in sort of 3 buckets. Our operations, our people, our workforce. How is that brought to life? Principally through DE&I initiatives and reconciliation initiatives. We think about our customer base and how we support and align to the SDGs with respect to our diverse banking offerings. How are we helping people who are underbanked, whether that might be newcomers in Canada or people without traditional banking relationships in Latin America. And then we think about our community presence and our influence, and this is really where we've put considerable effort over the last 3 years through our principal philanthropic effort called Scotia Rise. And this is really oriented at strengthening our communities through 3 principal interventions. Education, so access to high school and post-secondary education, helping newcomers feel at home and become economically viable, more quickly, and then supporting disadvantaged groups, so those individuals who are lacking social or economic capital to find employment opportunities and advance in their careers. So we feel through this framework that we have been informed and aligned to the SDGs, but that we have the flexibility also to speak to our various stakeholder groups and again align back to our principal core purpose.
Okay, that's great. Patrice, obviously your business is just a little bit smaller than Scotiabank. From your perspective, what are the SDGs that you're working on, and how are you, approaching this? And if you can provide some examples.
I said, good morning, everybody. I'm from the West Coast. I'm Patrice. I'm Anishinaabe. I'm a member of the Fort William First Nation, born and raised in Sioux Lookout, and currently a guest on the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, as I mentioned, out here in North Vancouver. I do have a fairly small company, but as an Indigenous person, our values were inherent right from day one. So we aren't actually, I don't feel like we're juggling per se, is that, we are easily hitting about 15 of the SDGs, simply because this is something that we were thinking about right from the very beginning of creating this company. How do we give back? How do we be a part of a community? How do we access different technologies that are going to allow us to not be extractive from the environment? How do we support other groups in bringing, single moms or people, who need work, these sorts of things. It's just, it was never, we should be shooting for these targets. We were there. And now we're using things like SDGs and our recent B Corp certification, which we sailed through, as a way of measuring and doing better. But it's literally been baked into the company from the beginning.
Okay, that's a very important takeaway for anybody watching. Nidhi, you're coming to us from India. Tell us about the SDGs that you're focused on at HCL.
Thank you, and I must pass on my congratulations for organizing this very pertinent discussion, especially in the current context when, and that too, globally, because in each country's context, I think SDGs do provide us that fundamental framework. And it's critical that now we start measuring, because 2030 is not far, and many of us have already committed the progress to be reported way before 2025. I think what I just want to share here is that, the larger context, and coming from a tech company, you must be wondering that beyond technology, how do we really contribute? But under our CSR agenda and the way we have formulated our corporate social responsibility policy, which applies to 60 plus countries wherever HCL Tech has a presence, we right in our preamble, we have taken an approach towards being fully progressively aligned to the SDGs. And the moment we say that, it's also about being a very broad-based organization with, I would say, decent resources. It becomes our first and immediate responsibility to be taking care of immediate neighborhood communities as well as the needs of the planet. So under that, and we are very fortunate to have our foundation in India, and which actually represents 1/7 of the world's population in a way, and anything that we do here directly impacts the growth and developmental agenda, the global growth and developmental agenda. So what we've been able to do is, one, we've been able to measure the impact right in the right framework, in right numbers. And I think that's critical. And that clearly tells us that while poverty alleviation is our larger goal, where definitely, whichever, and that's another, I would say, beauty of SDGs, that they're so interconnected that whichever you're working, you're surely working and impacting goal number one. So we have surely impacted, still counting, 5.5 million lives have been transformed. And within that, there is, and that's over 10 years through investment of $150 million US. But what we've been able to do is we've been able to apply the gender lens. 50% plus program participants are women. They come from far-flung communities. we don't leave, I mean, there are fact sheets in place. There are pockets with high maternal mortality, high infant mortality, less institutional delivery. So that actually takes us to SDG on health. And we do take one health approach. The moment we take one health approach, of course, environment comes into picture. But I think with more than 30,000 children who've been able to combat malnutrition, we are surely touching goal number 2. Quality education, I mean, we're still counting, but more than 200,000 adults who kind of been brought under our literacy programs, but close to, I mean, I can do the numbers, but 200,000, students who are directly benefiting across. But within that, we've integrated sports as a big agenda, which doesn't really find that kind of space. But if you look at holistic definition of education, surely some of these. But I was just going back to the brief on certain SDGs, which we just heard from you in Global Compact, the areas which are less worked upon, for example, water. Very happy to report that we have harvested 37 billion liters of surface water through various, very innovative nature-based solutions, water body rejuvenation, ponds, river streams, clearing them of invasive species, and so on and so forth. Talking about life on land, 1.5 million native species, and there's a lot of focus on native because we really understand environment quite closely, and there's technical investment happening, and that actually got us into national award of best in industry in India, which government of India recently recognized. But how all of this happens, I think we cannot do any of those. I mean, I can say that there's higher focus on couple of the SDGs, but of course, education, health, poverty alleviation, combating malnutrition, hunger approaches, life on land, life underwater, clean energy, all of these are there. But I think the investments are surely happening in goal number 17, where we are establishing right kind of partnerships, the public private partnerships. So to make any of these interventions sustainable, I think the ethos and the crux of the strategy that we have is that we invest quite heavily, both in terms of capacity as well as strategy, in establishing the public private partnership models. And that has made most of the programs that we have on ground sustainable as well as scalable. Of course, it is done through various mechanisms, and grant is one such major vehicle, which we have expanded to the Americas region. And I'm so happy to say that for our environmental goal, climate action, currently we are also accepting applications, including from Canada region. So lots to share, but this is all compiled in Ecosystems of Impact report, which we have just released. But what I just want to say is that it's important to have this global discourse, and how do we measure it for the farthest communities? That's critical. That will be the key to success when we measure.
Okay, so that's another important takeaway, is how we measure. But before we get to a bigger discussion about that point and some of the others that you've made, a lot of companies wonder, how do we get started? Some are just getting started. So Todd, I want to come to you on this question. How did Nutrien get started on SDGs?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rita. And I think when you look at what's being asked when it comes to building and sustaining engagement, it's that word engagement. What do your external stakeholders want to see? And ultimately, with sustainability strategies, it is to get to metrics and targets. What gets measured gets managed. And how do you do that? First steps, you have to kind of take a look and understand the SDGs and their impact and influence that you have on them. And then you have to get your leadership educated up on this. You got to get their support. And then you have to start to build out that global sustainability strategy that has the SDGs in it, and get to a place of the data, the metrics you need to measure your performance and build targets out on it. But more importantly, you have to take them public too. That's how you engage. This is how you get the stakeholder engagement and keep these real and alive, is allowing your stakeholders to come back, have conversation about what it is you're measuring, what you're trying to achieve in the future. But more importantly, on top of it all, and lessons learned on my side over 6-7 years here, is governance. You need to make sure that you have very strong governance in place from the creation of a strategy and targets, right through to development of it and approval of them, and then through the regular maintenance side of it and the performance side of this. And if you can do this well, Rita, you're going to have robust, resilient, long-term, if you will, commitments to these SDGs. And that's certainly learnings from my side and learnings to continue. This is a journey that we're on right now. So
that's fantastic. Maria, now that the bank's SDG programs are well established, what hurdles are you encountering or do you anticipate seeing on the horizon?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of what Todd outlined and maybe take a few different tacks on the question, because I think there's one piece that, it's a good type of pressure, it's a good type of momentum build, and that comes from your own people and your employees, because your people will often hold you to task on the commitments that you've made before any of the other external stakeholder groups that we often tend to be very focused on in these roles. And so I'd say from our standpoint, we have 90,000 employees globally. We, through our yearly employee engagement survey, we will ask our employees if they believe that Scotiabank is an environmentally responsible company, if they believe it's a socially responsible company. So we have an ability to test those waters on a regular basis. We commit to ongoing communication around our various programs. I really think the point about measurement is so important. We know standardization is coming in various upcoming regulations for ESG reporting. But if I just speak about social impact and the impact that we can make through corporate dollars, just giving money is not enough anymore. We do need to have to be able to demonstrate impacts. So on our side, we invested quite a bit in a social impact methodology that allows us to tell a story, and stories are very powerful in this space, about how many times we were able to support an individual in our community through our network of over 200 Scotia Rise partners. So employee engagement, measurement, very, very important. The last piece, I think, is around knowledge transfer and knowledge mobilization. We embarked earlier this year on a sort of focused effort to engage with our community partners to tackle some of the bigger pervasive problems in our society. How are newcomers, being supported to have their credentials realized, to be able to find gainful employment that's commensurate with their background and experience? How are we creating societies that are more accessible for all people who may be encountering barriers to work and employment, and inclusive leadership? And one of the most robust conversations we had with the not-for-profit sector was, how is the not-for-profit sector going down a path of becoming more diverse, more equity-deserving led, similar to how we're doing in financial services and the path that we're on. There's a mutual exchange of knowledge and information, and through that, I think, comes transparency and momentum, two things that are so critically important to sustaining progress on SDGs.
Okay, that's great. That's you've given a lot of relevant examples and information. Patrice, you mentioned that your company was recently B Corp certified, and I think you have about 2 to 3 full-time people. So it's pretty phenomenal that happened, given the size of your company. Perhaps you could talk to us a bit about the challenges that you face as a small company, growing quickly and still managing to incorporate SDGs.
I do that because my washing machine's on. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to add a little bit to the question about, how do you get started? And the fact is that, there are two groups of people. There are the people who don't care. And Elizabeth is going to be pushing government to force them to do what they need to do to hit Canada's SDGs, but it's going to be a long fight. And we'll be lucky if we get them across the finish line by the time that we're our goals that we're setting. Then there's the other half of people who do want to do something, but they feel like it's too big of a, like companies like these other three amazing companies that I'm here with. It does not have to be a giant company that you're doing this with, like with all these different pieces. What you have to do is you have to sit down and get started. There is the technology, you do have the supports out there to be able to start measuring these things. And again, I can't agree more about the measurement. We never measured anything when we were starting. But now that we've gone through several processes like getting B Corp certified, we realized that we were doing even far more than B Corp was asking us for. You don't know what it is that you should be measuring until you start jumping into these frameworks. So I would highly recommend just get started. Don't worry about the details. And, you've got this amazing group that is sitting here around you that I'm sure would be more than willing to help as well. As a very small Indigenous company, and just to be very clear, like just because we only have 2 full-time employees does not mean that's the size of the team. What we do is we hit, which I think is Canada's great untapped resource, which is stay-at-home moms and caregivers. Here we have incredibly ambitious, educated, hardworking people who get stuff done. So they work on their own times with their own little companies as contractors. I share my operations person with 3 other Indigenous companies so that we can all share that cost and, information as well. So, I think because I didn't start a business from a place of being having an MBA, I come from broadcasting actually. I didn't know the way that it was done, so I just recreated, something that was completely different that worked. And in a lot of ways, it worked better than the way that it's always been done. So don't think that, you don't have the capacity to do this, because I'll tell you, this is my office. I'm sitting here in my living room, and if I can do it, so can you.
Okay, so we're going to all learn from your example. That's fantastic. Nidhi, I'd like to get a little bit deeper into the how we build effective SDG programs. And you mentioned a bit earlier that you're a big fan of public-private partnerships. You've already told us a bit about why, but I'm hoping you can give us a few more details. And if you could share an example briefly about what has worked.
Thank you. And I think Todd did mention that it's all about strategy and whether we are thinking right or not. And there's always a time to start. I mean, it's never too late. So and one always gets mesmerized when you start measuring that you're actually doing way beyond already. So I think SDGs just provide us that framework. You're thinking about peace, partnerships, people, planet together as global leaders, as people who can influence, as people who are executing, as people. So I think the how part is where the role of executionists and people who have, I would say, power as well as resources, as well as qualifications, because each one of these SDGs, I would say, does need that professional expertise to bring right kind of projects on ground. So the merit here, or let's say the crux, is that are we really putting people, or let's say qualified workforce, behind everything that we are thinking? Because at the end of the day, it would be critical. HCL Foundation, we partner with 200 organizations through whom we have 2,000 people working on ground, and we ourselves are a workforce of 500 people. amongst the larger 250,000 HCL techies, 500 are qualified CSR professionals. I come from public health background. We have people, who are PhDs in wildlife sciences or water sciences, or who are economists, or who are medical doctors. So you do need for each one of these SDGs. Um, hands and feet, because at the end of the day it will matter. The other thing is, are our fact sheets in place? Are we even making our fact sheets right? I mean, though there could be a thought, there could be a vision, but each so I think two important words here is, are we studying the context and culture best? Because unless we really understand in which culture we are to apply, we'll never succeed. To give you examples, we work in far-flung remote communities of Northeast Nagaland. When we actually started the grant, which is again a huge NGO, I would say, recognition of the non-government organizations that we do through HCL Tech grants, and we identify models that work in terms of relevance and in terms of value for money, basically financial modeling, etc. The entire scoping is applied. But what are we looking for? We are still looking for communities which are completely left out, places which are yet not in the mainstream, because government is also doing a lot. Let's understand, everybody is working. So attribution is something which one can think about, but that is not something that should be driving us. It is our capability of taking challenge. It is our commitment. It is our willingness to go to those remote areas where perhaps we are needed more, because state has lots to do already. So to give you this example, when we started the grant program, the public health care centers, they were completely dysfunctional. There were so many maternal deaths in the region. The women were never able to reach a functional PHC where they could give birth, through a trained birth attendant. 5 years ago, when we started, and today, uh, the government has come on board. There is staff in these PHCs, there is infrastructure. They have also put in this. So with our limited funding, we were able to catalyze a lot around. Mothers groups are functional, roads have been constructed, and then the state system has got strengthened, where it's not just about 3 districts, but it's about the entire state, which is so. It used to take us 19 to 20 hours on road from one place to another just to travel. You can just imagine.
Wow.
So there are places where we've gone, and now with the latest, I would say, learning from all of this, now that we have launched the America's grant on climate action, we are again looking for localized action. We are again looking for community-based action. We are looking for something which will sustain only when we really understand the local context and culture through the lens of the communities who live there, because it is all about indigenous approaches at the end of the day which are going to sustain. So while SDG is a beautiful framework, it's a global framework, but it really needs localization through each corporate, through each government, through each block, through each individual who is working, and make it measurable in several ways. That's critical. So what we do is, and believe you me, that is the most difficult page when I do my own annual report. There's this page number 19 on ecosystems, of impact that we've just published. When I work with several flagship programs that we ourselves are implementing, and I ask the teams, let's write, even if it's 5 children or 15 mothers groups, but when we'll collate, our data will be in hundreds and thousands. But do we have means of verification to verify at the activity level that this is happening? So I think investment in right kind of M&E systems which are aligned to SDGs is another how, while we do it, we should measure it. But that's always, I would say, a journey that some of us enjoy. We're a little passionate about it, but there is, I would say, a charm in ensuring that your resources are well utilized, and it's a beautiful framework to do so.
Okay. That's great. I want to go back to Todd for a second, because he had mentioned on our prep call that Nutrien has targets related to its SDGs. Tell us about that, Todd, and also tell us why you felt that targets were important.
Well, just as previously mentioned, I think if you want to drive action And I think if you want true engagement as an organization, I think getting to targets is certainly key. And I think that what we talked about, Rita, there was about the system-based approach, and I think that's maybe you're wondering about that, and that approach we use to get to the targets. And so Nutria took great care in identifying our SDG priorities. We selected priority indicators that were the most relevant to our stakeholders and the extent to which a topic can be influenced by Nutria. And so what we did with that information then was took a systems-based approach. And so what is that? A systems-based approach, to SDG involves viewing and addressing the 17 goals as a coherent unit rather than just individually. And this approach recognizes that the progress in one area can certainly impact other goals, either positively or negatively. It can do both, and sometimes both at the same time. And it really kind of acknowledges that interconnection. And so what's a good example of that for us? Systems-based approach and the targets we ended up with really would be, ending hunger, SDG number 2, and addressing climate change, which is number 13. And so for us, we have to figure out how to lower greenhouse gas emissions in a manner that doesn't threaten food production. And this is quite the conundrum for our industry in agriculture is we got to maintain food security and feed a planet that's going to be 10 billion people by 2050 and maintain yields. But at the same time, we have to do that in a sustainable manner. We have to find ways to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions across our whole ag value chain. And so that's this interconnectivity that you see. And I mean, I look at our SDGs, we have interconnectivity everywhere. And so what happens then is we got to take a look and build a strategy out that will look at sustainable agriculture and our environmental footprint and build targets that'll help us to achieve 2 things at once. We have this commitment where we're committed to achieving 75 million acres, sustainable acres with our grower customers by 2030. What's that doing? It's doing 2 things. It's the interconnectivity. It's helping to still maintain yields, global yields for farmers, for the planet, but at the same time, it's helping farmers reduce their emissions. And so I always say to people, look for the opportunity as well. A lot of people will see these as challenges and risks, but understand there's always opportunity here in these as well. And that's where you really got to gravitate to is trying to find the opportunities and within these targets, not necessarily about how you're just mitigating risk.
Okay. I have a question for Maria. The economy is slowing, and some people have provided feedback saying, these programs are nice to have, but not critical during tougher economic times. Talk to us about that perspective. How do you keep the momentum up? How do you prevent the SDG programs from falling by the wayside during difficult economic periods?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think it's something, irrespective of sector or size of organization, what you want to ensure is, sustainable commitment. And it's a commitment that, endures beyond an individual or a particular program. I think professionals such as ourselves who have these roles where we bring forward at times the voices of stakeholders to our respective organizations is to continue to do that. I'll speak specifically about being a financial services organization. Stakeholder expectations are increasing, and I think that's a good thing. I think that forces us to respond in ways that demonstrate that we are committing to initiatives that are contributing to stronger communities around us. So I think it's keeping the voice of those stakeholder groups top of mind and making sure we don't become too myopic in terms of the pressures that we might be focused on in any given day or quarter. The other piece, again, I'll just pivot back to the importance of our people. regardless of where we are in the cycle right now economically, it's still hard to attract and retain great people. And oftentimes people will join organizations because of the quality of work, the opportunity for advancement, but also because those organizations stand in value for things that contribute to a greater sense of the community. And if we lose our people, we can't be successful. So I think we should always hold ourselves to that higher order and to that level of scrutiny.
Okay, we have just over 10 minutes left. Time has just flown by, but I want to try to get to as many audience questions as possible. And we already have one for Patrice. What resources or information sources are helpful for small businesses getting started with SDGs? Patrice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a great question because it's something that, I wouldn't really have known about until I had started to track it. And honestly, I'm going to pass it on to Elizabeth because I know you're not part of the panel, but I feel like you could really speak to this. And this is something that I would love to hear about more is this UN Global Compact and what supports you have. If we go to your website, what can we see there?
Well, thanks for throwing the ball to me, Patrice. I really appreciate that. And thanks so much for everything that you've shared today. So what's interesting about our panel today is Scotiabank, Nutrien, HCL, they're actually all participant companies in the UN Global Compact. And so they're larger companies, but as you probably know, or you probably could guess, I was just seeing the other day some stats, 97% of businesses in Canada are small and medium enterprises, right? So happily half of the companies in the UN Global Compact Network Canada are small and medium enterprises. And so we have a number of sort of open source tools that are for companies of any size. I would encourage people to look at a couple of things. One, on the Canadian website, which is unglobalcompact.ca, there's an SDG manager and even a great little testimonial of a company that's been able to use that to decide their materiality, right? What's important to them? What's important to their key stakeholders? Where does that align with sustainable development goals? And to really press on something Maria said, your people know, like they know a lot about where the changes can happen. If someone would ask me, I have this idea, if only there was a path for me to be able to share this idea where we can be reducing our footprint, where we can be doing better by our clients, why we can be doing better by the people that we're hiring. So I think that's part of it too. You can also go to the website to find open source inspiration, including our SDG in Action podcast, where actually Todd's colleague is one of the upcoming speakers talking about Nutrien and the way they hit so many SDGs at the same time. But to go forward and make that commitment to the 10 principles, to the reporting, then that opens up all kinds of other things like these accelerators and peer programs and working groups. We're so pleased to be introducing a biodiversity working group where companies, we know that Canadian companies are actually quite early on in their biodiversity journey. So our intention is to create Made in Canada tool and solution to bring that forward. So whether you make the commitment to be part of the compact or whether you're just looking for some tools to get your foot on the ladder, you find inspiration and tools there.
And I'm just going to add to that really briefly. Thank you, Elizabeth. It doesn't have to be a big thing. We're all crazy busy. We're small, medium businesses. We do not have employees whose job it is to do this. So just start setting aside a little bit of information, talk to your team, which is huge because then you get buy-in and they have great ideas as well. And make it something that you can do together. I know we're busy, but honestly, if you start now, it's going to snowball and you're going to be well on your way to being able to measure all of this stuff and have more and more conversations about it.
Absolutely. Agreed.
Okay, there's a very interesting question here that I'd like you all to weigh in on. Now, we only have 6 minutes left, so I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak about this. But how do you get your suppliers involved in SDG programs? Maria, maybe we can start with you on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a number of mechanisms that you could do through your onboarding and vetting process, whether that's through supplier diversity or reviewing their sustainability practices. At Scotiabank, we have a supplier code of conduct that we ask all our partners to sign to. So I think there are a number of formal mechanisms depending on your size and scale. And I certainly think, again, increasingly for large organizations, you are being expected to have your broader value chain come up to your prescribed standard for sustainability commitments.
Okay, we'll continue with our speed round here. I need to hear next.
I think there is so obviously they're a part of the larger ecosystem, and we are in a way one universe. So one, of course, is communication, right? Communication and right expectations. So setting your expectations right from the first stage is critical. And I think something which is very central to any framework which stands for global good is ethics. My personal experience is that anything which is done ethically, business, development programming, anything will bring us closer to a framework like SDGs. I mean, even if the economy is crashing down, nothing stops us from saving water or biodiversity around us, or doing volunteering, more volunteering when you have more time available, or looking at the communities around and doing our bit and sharing the resources better. So I think the entire framework actually revolves around fundamentals of ethics, and ethics can only be shared and understood. So whichever place we are in, if we are doing it right, we are definitely contributing.
Todd, maybe you want to take on the supplier question. Do you have anything to add on that?
Sure. I think both great recommendations there. Just to add on, supplier code. I think it might be one of the easiest ways to engage with your suppliers from an SDGs perspective, if you're very clear in the code what it is asking. And you can step past that too. I know we do have regional supplier agreements in Canada for Indigenous engagement in Saskatchewan. And we do have expectation of engagement with Indigenous businesses of our suppliers in Saskatchewan. And so you can have separate documentation. You can be regional with this too. You don't necessarily have to be corporate-wide global theme. That's tough to do, I think, when you deal with suppliers. You tend to have to get more regional based. But I would say to you, a supplier code is a great way to do that, because that's a public document that all suppliers can see up front.
Patrice, any final tips?
Ask the question. What are they doing? That's the first thing. You do have the ability to say no. Just yesterday, actually, I was having a conversation with 3 other businesses, and we were talking about a box company that none of us liked, and we don't like their values, but they're the cheapest out there. So we've decided that instead we're going to go together as a collective and go to someone who's a little more aligned with what we all believe in, see if we can get a pricing that is as close to this other company. And then, with our collective power, see if we can do better. So I think that you are the one who's in charge of what you want to do. And there's always other solutions if you can find different ways of looking at it.
Okay, that's great. That's very, practical advice. You're the one in charge. We only have about 1:45 left, but Elizabeth, I want to give you the last word here. Do business leaders have the right mindset to commit to SDGs? This is an audience question. The audience member points out for decades, revenue and profit have driven most of the decisions. Briefly, do businesses have the right mindset, or their leadership anyway?
Some, right? Yeah, no one can say that this is, holistically contained in business leaders, but there are some. There are some that have been able to rise above the dimensions of sort of quarterly earnings, career histories of a couple of years at a company before you move to the next piece. They're looking to the future. they are looking to their power. They're looking at putting people and planet before profits. And I encourage you as audience members to reward them, do business with them, work for them, influence them. You know them, you can see them. It's a very transparent world that we live in. And we hope that more and more get on board to help move things forward faster.
That's fantastic. That's some very practical advice, actually, from all of you. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave our conversation there. We're out of time. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would like to thank Nidhi, Todd, Patrice, Maria for being here today, and of course, Elizabeth for joining us for both the earlier discussion, but also for the audience questions. And special thank you to our sponsor, HCL Technologies, for making today's event possible. And of course, a big thank you to all of you in the audience for tuning in and for your very smart questions. We will send a link to the recorded webcast to all of the people who registered in about 2 weeks' time. Thank you again and enjoy your day.